Today, we are taking a deep breath and plunging into, well, one of the most intense and strategically devastating periods of the Second World War.
We really are.
We're looking at the final 5 months in Europe. So January to May 1945, a chaotic, absolutely brutal time that defined the ultimate collapse of Hitler's Third Reich.
You know, this period is often celebrated just for the victory, for VE Day.
Right.
But when you actually dig into the source material, you realize it was a time of almost unimaginable devastation and political turmoil, too.
So what's our mission today?
Our mission is to unpack how the German war machine, which was, facing certain inescapable defeat, somehow managed to drag this conflict out for 5 more agonizing months.
And critically, what that struggle set in motion for the post-war world.
Exactly.
We have a huge stack of sources in front of us, detailing the simultaneous, relentless advances of both the Western Allies and, of course, the Soviet Red Army.
And it wasn't just military operation. The sources making clear it was a desperate race to the center of the continent.
Fueled by political rivalry.
Absolutely. All culminating in the harrowing battle for Berlin.
So, to set the stage, by early 1945, Hitler's regime was undeniably entering its death throes, as the sources put it.
That's the perfect term for it. Strategically, they were beaten, they had lost the ability to produce material, they had no air superiority, and their manpower reserves were... they were gone.
So the struggle wasn't about winning anymore.
No, not at all. It was about maximizing destruction and delaying the inevitable. The central question the sources really wrestle with is, when did the final remaining German commanders, and maybe more importantly Hitler himself, finally concede that defeat was already a fact?
Okay, so let's start in the West. The Allies were assembled near the Rhine, and they were preparing for what they knew had to be the final push into the German heartland.
That's right.
By February 1945, you had these 2 vast, capable military forces ready to strike, and they were led by 2 very, very different men.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In the North, you had Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, so that's Canadian and British forces.
And Monty was meticulous.
Meticulous is the word. Cautious, a planner. He was not going to cross a major river until every single detail was accounted for, and he had, overwhelming superiority.
And then to his south, you have General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group,
which contained the star, or maybe the thorn, in Montgomery's side, depending on who you ask, General George Patton.
And his very aggressive U.S. Third Army.
Exactly. Patton was all about speed. He'd often ignore flanking security just for the sake of momentum.
So this wasn't just a coordinated assault. It was a deeply personal rivalry, wasn't it? To see who could get into Germany first.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
And Montgomery was determined to take the lead. On February 8th, his army group launched this massive 2-pronged assault near a place called Bion.
The goal being to clear the entire west bank of the Rhine before the main crossing.
Right. But the Germans, even in full retreat, were still capable of causing a lot of trouble.
And the terrain itself was a challenge, but the sources point to a specific, almost an environmental tactic the Germans used.
They did. The German forces released water from the dams on the Roer River. They intentionally flooded the lower areas.
And that delay was pretty significant.
It was profound. It hit the southern prong of Montgomery's offensive really hard. It essentially turned the ground into this massive, muddy lake.
Making heavy equipment useless.
Completely useless. And it delayed the link-up of his 2 corps for over 2 weeks. It was a calculated, last-ditch effort just to buy some time.
Despite that setback, though, the progress was steady.
It was. By early March 1945, Montgomery's forces controlled about 60 miles of the Rhine's west bank. But even as he's planning his huge, careful crossing, General Bradley's armies are speeding eastward to the south.
And they reached the Rhine near Cologne, but Hitler had a standing order.
A fanatical one.
Correct.
Destroy all bridges. Yeah. And the Germans were, for the most part, successful. They blew up every single crossing point as they retreated. The Rhine was meant to be the final impenetrable barrier.
And then the unbelievable surprise at Remagen, March 7th.
A date that changed everything.
Bradley's troops, scouting south of Cologne, find one bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge, still intact. How? Why did this one bridge survive?
The sources suggest it was a combination of German incompetence and just sheer Allied luck.
Really?
The German demolition squad had been preparing the charges, but the American advance was so fast they were just caught completely flat-footed.
So the U.S. forces just made a dash for it.
A desperate dash. They brushed aside what little resistance there was. Just as they hit the entrance, the German demolitions were triggered, but the main charges, they only partially detonated.
So the bridge stood.
It stood, badly damaged, creaking, but it was passable.
Incredible.
A small, truly heroic group of American soldiers immediately raced across, just cutting any wires they saw, demolition cables, communication lines, just in case there were secondary explosions planned.
And the U.S. commanders seized the opportunity.
Immediately, they started pouring troops across, securing this vital, completely unexpected foothold on the eastern bank of the Rhine.
That must have been just a crushing blow to German morale and an instant strategic nightmare for Hitler.
The strategic significance, I mean, you can't overstate it. This was the door to the German heartland, opened weeks before the Allies ever thought it would be. And yes, Hitler's reaction in Berlin was swift and utterly brutal.
What were the immediate repercussions of that failure at Ramazan?
The sources detail just an explosion of rage from the Führer. He's blaming incompetence, treason, everything.
He needed scapegoats.
And he found them. 5 junior officers involved in defending the bridge were caught, swiftly court-martialed, and 4 of them were executed by firing squad immediately.
Wow.
And on top of that, Hitler sacked Field Marshal Guillaume Rundstedt, the commander in the West, for the second time in less than a year.
Who did he replace him with?
Field Marshal Albert Kessler, a seasoned veteran brought in from the Italian front. But this constant turnover, this internal terror, it just shows how fragile the whole command structure had become.
And the Germans tried everything to undo that breakthrough, didn't they?
They did. They threw desperate air attacks at the Remagen Bridge for over a week, training to destroy it, but nothing worked.
Which makes what happened next so ironic.
It's a striking anticlimax. After all that strategic importance, the human cost, Hitler's fury, the Remagen Bridge just collapsed on its own.
When was this?
March 17th, 10 days after its capture. It collapsed while combat engineers were trying to repair it.
28 men died in that collapse. So the initial thrust into Germany was ultimately blocked by an engineering failure, not enemy action.
A very bizarre footnote in history. But by then, the momentum was unstoppable. Montgomery, meanwhile, he's sticking to his plan. He prepared Operation Varsity.
This was the first full-scale Allied crossing.
Right, launched further north on March 23rd, 1945.
And when Montgomery plans, he plans big. This was a spectacle of overwhelming force.
Oh, it was immense. The operation started with a colossal aerial bombardment. Over 200 RAF Lancaster bombers essentially wiped the town of Wiesen off the map just to soften the defenses.
And then the crossing itself.
British commandos in these Buffalo amphibious vehicles.
Yeah.
They met very little resistance. The German defenders were just dazed by the air assault.
And the next day came the airborne component. And this was the largest single airborne operation of the entire war.
It was. 17,000 men from the British 6th and U.S. 17th Airborne Divisions were dropped behind enemy lines to seize key positions.
But they didn't have it as easy as the commandos.
No, the airborne troops paid a heavy price. They faced intense German anti-aircraft fire. The sources report that more than half of the gliders they used were destroyed or seriously damaged, either before or during landing. High casualties.
But they succeeded. Within hours, the paratroopers had linked up with Montgomery's land forces and the bridgehead was secure. This should have been Montgomery's triumphant moment.
And it was a success, a huge success, but he was completely upstaged.
By his rival.
By his great rival, Patton. Operating under Bradley's command further south, he had crossed the Rhine unexpectedly near Oppenheim the night before Montgomery's massive public operation.
Without any of the fanfare, he just did it.
He just did it. He beat the British commander into Germany.
And that really captures the dynamic of the final race, doesn't it? Montgomery moving towards Münster in the north, while Bradley's forces are pushing deep into the center, encircling industrial cities like Frankfurt.
The German defenses along the Rhine were just collapsing. It was a clear signal that the end of organized resistance in the West was just weeks away.
Now, while all this fierce fighting was happening in the West, the real crushing blow against the Third Reich was happening at the same time, hundreds of miles to the east.
Delivered by the Soviet Red Army.
And the situation for the German forces on the Eastern Front was, it was dramatically worse. We're talking about an army just utterly depleted.
Critically ill-prepared. The sources reveal just the staggering depths of the resource crisis.
Like what?
German units were so low on basic supplies that soldiers were reduced to using, get this, First World War rifles.
Wow. In 1945.
In 1945. Meanwhile, German intelligence is reporting that the Red Army infantry outnumbers them 11-1. Overwhelming superiority in tanks, artillery, aircraft, everything.
And they had no reserves left.
Virtually no strategic reserve. It had all been used up or destroyed in failed offensives in the West.
The Russian offensive began on January 12, 1945, and it was heralded by just an unprecedented display of firepower.
A 300-mile-long artillery barrage. It was basically an open invitation for the troops to advance. And what followed was a triumph of speed, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov. This was not the grinding, slow push that defined the earlier campaigns.
The speed was truly historic.
In just 14 days, the Red Army advanced 300 miles.
300 miles.
They drove into the ruins of Warsaw, then Krakow. Military historians rightly categorize this as one of the fastest and longest blitzkrieg advances in history.
And by the end of January?
They'd crossed the German border and reached the Oder River. They were now less than 40 miles, maybe an hour's drive, east of Berlin.
That pause at the Oder, where the Soviets stopped to regroup, must have been excruciating for the Germans. They had a moment to breathe, but the threat was right there.
And this is where Hitler's decision-making really breaks from military reality.
It seems like by this point he's living in a completely different world.
A delusional world, driven by ideology, not strategy. His deep, paranoid distrust of his professional army generals led him to make some, frankly, disastrous appointments.
Like appointing SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, a political leader, not a military one.
Yeah, exactly. To command forces in the neighboring region, Himmler had zero military knowledge or experience.
And how did that go?
Unsurprisingly, the forces under his command were quickly and savagely defeated by the Russian advance in February. But the more profound strategic blunders concerned resources that really could have saved Berlin.
The sources constantly highlight two critical wasted opportunities. First, the Kurland Peninsula.
Kurland. This is where we see the absolute primacy of Nazi ideology of Lebensraum over any military sense.
Lebensraum meaning living space. This was his core belief.
It was everything. And he refused to allow 200,000 German troops occupying the Kurland Peninsula in Latvia to break out and help the collapsing Eastern Front.
But why? Why hold on to this irrelevant patch of land surrounded by the enemy?
Because in Hitler's mind, abandoning occupied territory, no matter how useless it had become, was an ideological betrayal.
Yeah.
He was committed to holding every scrap of Lebensraum.
So 200,000 soldiers just sat there.
They spent the final crucial months of the war completely encircled, doing absolutely nothing of military value when they could have been fighting desperately to defend the capital. It was just an epic waste of manpower rooted in delusion.
And the second major strategic mistake was his obsession with oil.
Yes. General Heinz Guderian, Hitler's acting chief of staff, he begged the Führer to send any reserves to the Eastern Front. And Hitler agreed to pull back the elite 6th SS Panzer Army from the west.
But he didn't send them to Berlin.
No. Instead of sending them to defend the route to Berlin, Hitler diverted this elite armor division to Hungary. He was obsessed with defending Germany's last remaining source of oil near Lake Balaton.
A classic case of micromanagement undermining the entire strategy.
And it proved to be a total disaster on the battlefield. It was doomed from the start. The panzers were hopelessly outnumbered.
And then the weather turned against them.
To compound their problems, a sudden thaw turned the ground into this massive, impassable swamp of mud. It completely neutralized their armored advantage. They struggled for days before being forced into a devastating retreat toward Vienna.
And that's where we get that bit of dark humor from the commander, right?
Yes. The commander of that unit, SS General Sepp Dietrich, was totally aware of their state. He famously quipped, "We call ourselves the 6th Panzer Army because we have only 6 panzers left."
6 tanks left.
That says everything about how hollowed out Germany's once elite fighting units had become. By April 10th, the Red Army took Vienna, having just swept aside one of Germany's last great fighting forces.
And as the military collapse accelerated, the resulting humanitarian catastrophe on the Eastern Front was simply unimaginable.
The word the sources keep using is vengeance. The Russian forces had seen firsthand the unspeakable horrors the Germans perpetrated in the Soviet Union. The massacres, the scorched earth policies.
So as they crossed into German territory, they were seeking payment.
They were. And the sources recount these horrific stories of Russian rape, murder, and pillage. This triggered mass panic among the German civilian population, particularly in East Prussia and Pomerania.
And more than 5 million German civilians fled their homes?
5 million. We're talking about vast numbers of people families, the elderly, women traveling west in bitter sub-zero temperatures and snow. The sheer scale of this desperate exodus just overwhelmed any remaining German governance.
And for those trying to escape by sea, the risks were just as profound.
2 million people were evacuated by sea from German-held ports. And these crowded passenger ships, they became targets for Soviet submarines.
The sources say 24 German passenger ships were torpedoed.
And the most devastating example, the one that truly underscores the horror of the collapse, was the sinking of the cruise liner Wilhelm Gustloff.
The numbers associated with that are just staggering.
Over 10,000 people on board, mostly refugees, women, children, wounded soldiers. After it was torpedoed, barely 1,000 survived the freezing waters.
The sources call it the worst loss of life ever in a single incident at sea.
And it is. This single tragedy is a profound reminder of the ultimate human price paid during those chaotic final months.
So the fate of Berlin was sealed, but for the Western Allies, there was this major political dilemma facing Eisenhower. Berlin was less than 300 miles from their advanced positions.
And a lot of commanders, Patton especially, desperately wanted to race the Soviets there.
They wanted to take Berlin.
Absolutely, both for the military glory and, to prevent it from falling completely into Soviet hands.
But the decision wasn't military, was it?
No, it was political. Made earlier at the Yalta Conference, the Allies had already agreed on post-war zones of occupation, and Berlin was deep inside the agreed-upon Russian zone.
So Eisenhower instructed his commanders to ignore Berlin?
He did. He told them to focus on spreading out, securing the rest of the country, preventing Hitler from retreating to some mythical mountain redoubt in the south, and securing the industrial heartland.
And that led to Operation Ruhr Pocket starting April 1st.
A critical maneuver. This involved U.S. troops encircling the vast industrial cities of the Ruhr region. And German resistance here was stiff.
These were vital resources.
They knew it. But the encirclement was complete. 2 weeks later, the whole area fell.
And the number of prisoners was huge.
Staggering. 325,000 German troops were taken prisoner, one of the largest single hauls of the entire war. And the collapse of the Ruhr meant the loss of Germany's capacity to produce coal and steel. It was the industrial death blow.
And the German commander there, Field Marshal Walter Model.
A die-hard Nazi. He committed suicide rather than face capture.
Elsewhere, Bradley's forces just surged across the country. By April 18th, U.S. forces reached the Czech border, basically splitting Germany in two.
Resistance was disorganized, largely ineffectual at that point.
Meanwhile, up in the north, Montgomery's Canadian First Army began the liberation of Holland. And this was a bittersweet victory, defined by the immense suffering the Dutch had endured.
The bitter winter of 44-45.
The sources paint a devastating picture of that, don't they?
They do. The German occupation forces had systematically seized and diverted food and fuel supplies out of the country.
For their own garrisons and the war effort.
Right. And this led to widespread deaths from starvation and cold among the Dutch civilians. A truly engineered humanitarian disaster.
The Canadian advance was rapid, though. Ardennes fell April 15th, Groningen shortly after. But there was still a large German army surrounded near Amsterdam.
A major risk. A ceasefire was negotiated specifically to address the starvation crisis.
And that allowed Allied aircraft to conduct Operation Manna.
Flying over the Dutch countryside, dropping essential food and medical supplies to the starving population below. That transition from fighting to immediate large-scale relief really highlights the scale of destruction they were finding.
And in parallel, the British Second Army was pushing across the North German plain.
They faced fierce, sustained resistance at the port of Bremen. It took 9 days of brutal house-to-house fighting before it was finally secured.
And just 2 days after that, they reached the Elbe River at Lauenburg.
The German front was now collapsing everywhere, often in these isolated, fanatical pockets of resistance, but collapsing nonetheless.
But as the Allies advanced, they weren't just encountering fierce fighting. They were uncovering new, horrific evidence of the Nazis' systematic final solution.
The sheer scale of the atrocity really began to reveal itself. The first major discovery mentioned was in early April 45, when U.S. troops overran the concentration camp at Ohrdruf near Weimar.
The SS had tried to evacuate it?
They had, but they left behind undeniable evidence, piles of bodies.
General Eisenhower was taken to the camp personally. What was the impact of that visit?
He was visibly and profoundly shocked. He immediately ordered all nearby combat troops who weren't actively fighting to visit the camp so they could see with their own eyes what they were fighting against.
He knew this was evidence that needed to be documented.
Immediately. Not just for the soldiers, but for the world.
And just 8 days later, the British troops made an even larger, more infamous discovery at Belsen concentration camp.
Belsen was truly horrifying. They found over 70,000 prisoners. Thousands were already dead, lying alongside the living, all of them starving, disease-ridden.
And the sources provide one of the most powerful, harrowing accounts of the entire war. The radio broadcast by BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby.
Dimbleby's account of Belsen shocked the public back home immediately. He described passing through the barrier and finding himself in the world of a nightmare.
He gave this visceral account of the living lying with their heads against the corpses and this awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people.
But crucially, he stressed, very deliberately, this is what the Germans did, let there be no mistake about it, did deliberately and slowly.
That distinction, the deliberate, methodical nature of it, must have had a profound effect on the Allied mindset.
Absolutely. It shifted the war from merely defeating a powerful enemy to confronting a moral evil. The immediate public documentation of these camps solidified support for absolute, unconditional surrender and laid the crucial moral groundwork for the future pursuit of war criminals.
There could be no negotiated peace with such a regime.
None.
And finally, way down south, far from Berlin, the German front in Italy was also crumbling.
Under the weight of the Allied Spring Offensive, led by Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander on April 9th, British and U.S. troops crossed the Po River.
And the German commander there, General Heinrich von Wiedinghoff, he realized it was over.
He did. His forces were spent. On April 29th, he approached the Allies and surrendered unconditionally.
This was a hugely significant moment.
It was.
Because it was the first formal German surrender anywhere in Europe.
Correct. The first time a major command admitted total defeat and laid down its arms. The surrender took effect May 2nd, sending a clear psychological message to everyone else that the cause was lost.
Now, before the final curtain fell on Berlin, there was this symbolic moment of unity, right? The meeting on the Elbe River near Leipzig on April 26th.
A powerful, if brief, moment. A small detachment of the American 69th Infantry Division was rowed across the river to meet their Soviet counterparts.
And the sources describe this immediate, almost chaotic fraternization.
Soldiers meeting, exchanging cigarettes and souvenirs. It was the physical manifestation of the combined two-front pressure that had finally brought Germany to its knees.
But the immediate focus remained entirely on the capital, on Berlin. Stalin had finalized his plan on April 1st, deploying absolutely massive resources for the final assault.
We're talking about a terrifying military machine, 2.5 million men.
2.5 million.
Equipped with 6,000 tanks and an unbelievable 40,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers.
And the plan was two-pronged.
Yes. Marshal Zhukov would lead the main charge from the Oder, while Marshal Konev would swing up from the Nicer River further south.
And who was left to defend Berlin against this behemoth?
About 1 million German defenders, but that number is really misleading.
It was a mixed bag.
A pathetic mix. Some seasoned combat veterans, SS fanatics, and tragically masses of inexperienced conscripts. This included the Volkssturm, the People's Army.
Mostly elderly men and boys.
Boys as young as 14. They had minimal training, little equipment, and often just their desperate loyalty to the Führer.
The Germans had prepared strong defensive positions, though, particularly along the Silo Heights.
Right in front of Zhukov's main assault point. And while this battle was being set, Hitler was safely ensconced in his bunker beneath the Reichschancellery.
And the sources paint this picture of total physical and psychological decline.
A heavily medicated, shambling figure, just consumed by delusion, issuing utterly unrealistic orders to military units that barely existed anymore.
His last public appearances were heartbreaking, inspecting a small group of fresh-faced Hitler Youth soldiers in early March.
That was the last time the German people saw their Führer alive. And amidst this state of total denial, there was this single fleeting moment of false hope for the Nazi leadership.
The death of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, April 13th.
Yes. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels seized on it. He tried to convince the increasingly unstable Führer that the Allied alliance would immediately collapse.
A miracle.
He was suggesting a German victory could still be snatched from the jaws of defeat. He called it a miracle akin to the 18th century miracle of the House of Brandenburg.
But 3 days later, on April 16th, Zhukov's assault began. And the miracle didn't materialize.
It did not. Though Zhukov had immense firepower, he initially struggled. The German defense at Silo Heights was clever. They anticipated the bombardment and pulled back.
So when Zhukov's infantry advanced, they met unexpectedly heavy resistance.
He threw his tanks in and they quickly bogged down, creating this chaotic bottleneck.
Meanwhile, Konev was having better luck to the south.
Significantly better. Konev's troops crossed the Nicer River successfully, and Stalin, who actively promoted rivalry among his top marshals to ensure maximum effort.
Right.
He immediately authorized Konev to swing his tanks north toward Berlin, happily encouraging a full-blown race to take the city.
That internal Soviet rivalry just expedited the inevitable.
It certainly did. By April 25th, the Soviet armies met up, encircling the capital, and the final brutal assault on the city itself began.
And as the fighting devolved into block-by-block combat, the suffering of the German civilians peaked.
The sources confirm the tragic reality of the Soviet entry into Berlin. As civilians emerged from cellars, often waving white flags, the Russians took a little notice.
The sources confirmed the tragic and widespread rape of German women and girls.
As the Soviet forces exacted their vengeance in a horrifying way.
Yes. By the morning of April 30th, the few remaining defenders, the SS, the most fanatic Volkssturm, were pinned down in a narrow strip of central Berlin.
And the Soviets began their assault on the Reichstag, the ultimate symbol of Nazi power.
The fighting was savage.
The Soviets brought up heavy artillery and just blasted the building at point-blank range before fighting room to room for 4 hours.
And the famous red flag was eventually hoisted on the roof.
It was, though the sources point out that this iconic moment was actually restaged the following morning, May 1st, for the cameras, to satisfy Stalin's demands for visual proof of victory.
But by the time that flag flew, the war's greatest antagonist was already gone.
On April 30th, 1945, as the final battle raged just overhead, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. He had married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, the day before. She died with him.
And their bodies.
Their partially burned bodies were carried up into the Reich's Chancellery Garden and buried in a shallow crater. A profoundly small, inglorious end for the man who promised a 1,000-year Reich.
The power structure just dissolved into chaos. Hitler had named Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor.
And the immediate propaganda line was that Hitler fell in battle, and the German people were urged to fight on against the Bolshevik menace.
But the leadership still trapped in the bunker Goebbels and Bormann. They knew it was hopeless.
They tried to negotiate a ceasefire, but Marshal Zhukov demanded the unconditional surrender of all German forces everywhere.
Which was impossible for them to deliver.
Correct. Later that evening, Joseph Goebbels and his wife, Magda, killed their 6 children with cyanide and then committed suicide themselves.
Man, Bormann.
Bormann disappeared. His body was later found and confirmed through DNA testing. The next morning, May 2nd, the last remaining defenders of Berlin formally surrendered. The fighting in the city finally stopped.
As Berlin fell, the new leader, Grand Admiral Dönitz, tried desperately to salvage some political capital from the military ruins.
His primary goal was to avoid surrendering to the Russians at all costs.
This political maneuvering is key.
It is. Dönitz sent a delegation to Field Marshal Montgomery on May 4th, offering to surrender all German forces in northern Germany.
But Montgomery understood the principle of unconditional surrender.
He did. He rejected the partial surrender. He informed the delegation that he could only accept the surrender of the forces actively fighting him.
He didn't have the authority to accept on behalf of the Americans or the Russians.
Exactly. Dönitz had to agree to Montgomery's terms for the forces in the north. But he tried again.
He sent another delegation to General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander,
attempting to negotiate a peace deal solely with the West. Eisenhower was unyielding. He had the full backing of Roosevelt and Churchill's policy. Only the unconditional surrender of all German forces was acceptable.
So Dönitz was forced to capitulate entirely.
Which led to the first formal signing of the unconditional surrender document at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France.
At 2:41 a.m. on May 7th, 1945.
General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, signed for the Germans. Walter Bedell Smith signed for the Western Allies. And crucially, General Ivan Sislerov signed for the Soviet Union. The war in Europe was officially over.
But the story of the surrender has this fascinating, immediate political twist. Stalin was not happy.
Not at all. Not with the location, not with the low-ranking Soviet representative. He felt the Soviet Union had paid the highest price, tens of millions of casualties, unimaginable destruction, and he demanded a ceremonial humiliation of the German leadership on Soviet terms. In the capital they had conquered.
So he countermanded Sislerov's signature.
He did. Which meant a second, more formal signing had to be organized just to satisfy him.
And that happened on May 8th in Berlin.
Exactly. A second surrender document was signed. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's former chief of staff, signed for the defeated Germans. Marshal Zhukov signed for the USSR, and Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder signed for the Western Allies.
And that dual signing is why May 8th officially became Victory in Europe Day,
fulfilling the unconditional surrender demands for everyone.
As crowds erupted in celebration in London and New York, there was this sobering awareness of the immense, immediate problems facing the world.
The sources highlight two massive issues. First, the war against Japan was still raging fiercely in the East.
And second, Europe was physically, economically, and socially in ruins. The scale of the immediate humanitarian crisis was just staggering.
The practical challenges the Allies faced immediately were, well, they were enormous. Millions of concentration camp victims and slave laborers, the displaced persons, or DPs, needed immediate help. Repatriation, medical aid.
And millions of captured German soldiers needed screening.
Before being released, yes. Particularly identifying and arresting major war criminals. The SS was specifically targeted due to its direct role in the atrocities.
Leading Nazis were rounded up pretty quickly. Goering, Speer, Jodl, Dennett.
Among the first to be taken into custody. They were eventually put on trial at Nuremberg.
And what's fascinating about the Nuremberg trials is the unique legal challenge the Allies faced.
They were trying men for crimes that had never been legally defined before. They were establishing legal precedents like crimes against humanity and crimes against peace.
An extremely challenging legal environment.
It was groundbreaking. The sources detail the atmosphere of those trials, where the surviving Nazi leadership were confronted with the visual and testimonial evidence of their actions.
The sentences ranged from the death penalty to imprisonment.
They did? And we see that tragic final act of desperation when Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, committed suicide the night before he was due to be hanged.
The ultimate political consequence of the war, the division of the continent, was codified just 2 months after the surrender at the Potsdam Conference.
This conference was the political sequel to the military collapse. The immediate practical result was the division of Germany into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, British, American, and French.
And even Berlin, which was deep within the Soviet zone, was partitioned in the same way.
It was. But the conference wasn't just administrative. It was where the immediate disagreements between East and West really began to surface.
The friction started right away.
Absolutely. Particularly over reparations and the future governance of Germany. Stalin wanted massive, immediate reparations drawn from the Western zones,
while the West understood that stripping Germany bare would create long-term instability.
The seeds of division were sown right there, over the rubble of the conquered capital.
So the peoples of Europe weren't just liberated from Nazism, they were instantly divided, some falling under the orbit of the Western Allies, and others under the control of Communist Russia.
The end of the Greatest War was, in effect, the immediate beginning of the next global conflict. A profound shift that redefined the next half-century.
And that brings us to the end of this incredibly dense and emotionally complex deep dive into the final reckoning of the Reich. I mean, the speed of that collapse, from the Red Army reaching the Oder in 14 days to the fall of Berlin in a single chaotic month. It's truly breathtaking.
It is.
VE Day was a necessary celebration, but the sources underscore how profoundly mixed that joy was with the reality of ruin, of suffering, and of vengeance across the entire continent.
What stands out most to me is the direct consequence of Hitler's delusional leadership. His obsession with holding on to useless ideological land claims, his fixation on the Hungarian oil fields.
These decisions directly contributed to the total military collapse of the Eastern Front.
And rendered the defense of Berlin utterly hopeless. It makes the unified pressure of the Allied forces, despite their bitter internal rivalries, the definitive factor in the total and swift demise of the Reich.
And as we reflect on the final moments, the source materials show that even after General Jodl signed the unconditional surrender in Reims, France, Stalin immediately countermanded the order
And demanded a second, separate ceremony in Berlin.
ensuring the USSR was visibly at the center of the German humiliation. What does this immediate, sharp political maneuvering, literally before the rubble was cleared and the displaced were housed, tell us about the inevitable future direction of the Allied relationship and the world?
It's a great question. That confrontation over the ceremonial surrender was really the first salvo of the Cold War.
A provocative thought for you to consider. How much of the future division of Europe was truly baked into the war's conclusion versus how much was actively created in those immediate weeks following the surrender?
The question of Soviet legitimacy and Western influence set the stage for decades of tension.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.